May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So today is a feast day, the feast of St. Francis. And on a feast day, we often tell the story of the people who the Church has chosen to remember as examples. And Francis is our patron saint of the environment and of animals. And so we hear his story today. Long time ago, in the year 1181, in a hill town in Italy called Assisi, a young man was born. Now, he was a fine young man, and he grew up enjoying all the fine things in life. His family had money, and he loved to party, and he loved good food. I love good food. And wine, and being with his friends. And his father was wealthy because he was a cloth merchant. And so Francis liked fine clothes and dressing up. And he was also the life of the party. He was known for telling stories and jokes and singing and keeping all of his friends in good spirits. Now Francis really, above all things, wanted to be a knight. The countries of Europe were embarking on the Crusades, and so he wanted to be a knight and fight. And so his father gave him a horse and armor and all the equipment you needed, and Francis went off to battle. But Francis was captured in his first battle, and he was put in prison and held for ransom. He was there for a year. It was a year before he could go outside and go home and be with his family again. But while he was there, he was known still for telling stories and singing and keeping up the spirits of his friends. So Francis went home. And Europe continued on crusade. And so he asked to go on the fourth crusade, and his father gave him another horse and another set of armor. And Francis set out to be a hero and go to battle again. But this time, on the road, he heard the voice of God. And he heard the voice of God saying, "Francis, this is not the way for you." And so Francis turned around and headed home. And on the way home, he encountered a knight, but a knight who did not have all of the fine equipment that Francis had. And so Francis gave the knight his fine cloak and continued on his way home. And when he got home, his friends teased him for giving up on being a soldier, and his father was angry because he had wasted all that money. But Francis continued in prayer. So Francis was praying one night in the church of St. Damian, which you might have heard called San Damiano. And this church was old and derelict and falling down around him, but he was praying there and he heard the voice of God again. And the voice of God said, "Francis, repair my church." And Francis, looking around and taking this kind of literally, said, "Okay." Then he went back to his father's shop and he took cloth and beautiful goods from his father's shop and he sold them to raise the money to rebuild the church. His dad was not thrilled. He was very angry, and he told Francis he had to give back all of that money and any of the cloth that he hadn't sold. And Francis did, but he was also himself very angry, and he was going to rebuild this church because he had heard God's voice, and they had a huge fight right in front of the store, in the public, in front of everyone, right in the town square. And Francis said, "I am going to rebuild this church." And he took off all of his fine clothes, and he left all of his belongings, the story says, in a pile in front of his father, and went off to live in the woods wearing only a itchy woolen robe like the poorest people wore. And Francis went into the woods in his itchy robe. But he was full of joy because there was nothing between God and him and his path. Francis still was growing into this calling, and there were still some things that made him uncomfortable. And one of those things were lepers. Lepers were people in that time who lived with a disease that disfigured them, and people were afraid of them. And so they lived apart from other people, and because of that, they were often very poor and hungry. And Francis was afraid of lepers. But one day, as he was walking, he encountered a leper, and even though he was afraid, he reached out and embraced the man. And suddenly he was full of joy, and he felt the presence of God, and felt connected to this person. And he thanked him, and he went on his way singing. But then he turned around to say goodbye, and the leper had vanished from the road. Some of Francis's friends, who'd been his party friends even, they were inspired by his example, and they came and they joined him. And they lived in the woods or in simple accommodation and owned nothing, and gave everything they could to the poor and needy. And one of Francis's friends, Claire, came to him as well, inspired by his example. The story is that she came to him one night, came to the brothers, and they all lived together. She came to the brothers dressed in her fine clothes, and he welcomed her in. And then the next couple of days, he went and found a place for her and the women who came with her later to live together and also follow their simple rule of life. And the brothers called each other brother. And so Franciscan monks are known as brother to this day. And the sisters call each other sister. And the nuns are also called sister to this day. And there are Franciscan monks and nuns up in San Francisco if you ever want to go worship with them. Francis and Claire remained friends the rest of their lives, and they gathered their communities periodically to pray, but also eat together and tell stories. Francis continued to spend a lot of time outside, in the woods, in the wild, praying and talking to God. And he felt connected to all of creation and felt that all of creation spoke of God's presence and glory. Francis even famously preached to the birds and the animals. Francis saw God's presence and glory even in things that some of us would find scary, things that are terrifying or dark or alarming. And there's a story about that too. One day, Francis heard that the people of a nearby town were afraid to go outside the walls of the town. The name of the town was Gubbio. They were afraid to let their animals graze outside on the hillside. They were afraid to let their children play outside. They were afraid of a wolf. So Francis went to Gubbio, and he walked outside the walls of the city, and he walked out, and he met the wolf. And he said to the wolf, "Brother Wolf, you need to stop terrifying and bothering and eating the animals of the people of Gubbio." And the wolf said, "Brother Francis, what am I to do? I am hungry. I am starving. Also, newsflash, I am a wolf." So Francis invited the wolf to come back with him into the town. And they walked up the hill into the town square. And Francis said to the people of Gubbio, "This is your brother. He is hungry. You should feed him." And so from then on, every day, a different family in the town fed the wolf And that was the end of them being afraid. Francis saw God's glory proclaimed in all of creation, and he wrote a poem about this called The Canticle of the Creatures. I'm sure you've sung it or heard it. And it said, God is praised in brother sun and sister moon. God is praised in our sister, Mother Earth, and in all the bright flowers that grow on her. God is praised through sister water and brother fire. God is praised through the wind and the air, and even through our sister death, who comes to all. And most of all, God is praised through all those who dwell together in peace. We remember Francis. This is the oldest image of Francis. We remember him because he lived simply and had no possessions. We remember him because he served the poor and the hungry. We remember him because he loved everything and everyone. We remember him because he loved God. We remember Francis because he was full of love. I wonder what part of this story was your favorite? And I wonder what part of the story you think was the most important part. I wonder which part of the story is about you. Where are you in this story? And how does creation speak to you? How and where do you hear the voice of God? I invite you now to turn, preferably to someone not in your pod, but stay safe, and talk to each other for a few minutes about these wondering questions. If you are a reader, they are in your leaflet. And in 3 or 4 minutes, you'll hear some lovely music inviting you to return your attention to the rest of the service. I wonder.